The first message came on a night when heavy snow covered the streets of their quiet Illinois suburb, turning everything white and still. And Claire Whitman stood by the living room window watching the wind push against the glass, while Robert slept in his recliner with the television humming softly. Without thinking too much, she picked up her phone and typed a simple text to Daniel Harper, asking if he and Emily had made it home safely because the roads looked dangerous. And when his reply came almost instantly saying they had just pulled into the driveway and thanking her for checking, a small warmth spread through her chest that surprised her with its intensity. It should have ended there, but it didn't, because he added another message saying he always appreciated how thoughtful she was. And Claire stared at the words longer than necessary before typing back that she was glad they were safe, then setting the phone down, only to pick it up again minutes later when another notification appeared. He told her the drive had been quiet, that Emily had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, and that sometimes silence felt heavier than noise, and Claire understood exactly what he meant. Over the next few days, the messages stayed simple, asking about her book club, telling her about a long day at work, sharing small complaints about the cold weather. But there was an ease between them that felt different from normal family conversations, and Claire began to notice that she looked forward to the soft vibration of her phone in a way she hadn't anticipated. She told herself it was harmless, just two adults talking about life. Yet she found herself smiling at his jokes and rereading his thoughtful responses when he asked about her favorite novels or remembered details she had mentioned in passing weeks earlier. Daniel, on his end, felt understood in a way he hadn't felt for years, because when he told Claire about feeling stuck in a job he didn't love or unsure about where his marriage was heading, she didn't dismiss him or change the subject. She listened, even through a screen, and her replies were careful and kind. One afternoon, he stopped by the Whitman house to return a toolbox Robert had lent him. Knowing Robert was still at work and Emily was visiting a friend, and Claire opened the door, surprised but not uncomfortable, inviting him in with a polite smile. They stood in the kitchen again, the same room where their earlier conversation had shifted something unspoken, and Daniel thanked her for her messages, saying it meant more than she probably realized. And Claire felt her pulse quicken as she brushed it off lightly, saying everyone needs someone to talk to. He noticed her new blue sweater and said it suited her, and the compliment was gentle, not inappropriate. Yet it stayed with her long after he left because Robert hadn't noticed her clothes in years. When Daniel walked back to his car, he felt both lighter and heavier at the same time, aware that the connection growing between them was no longer casual, but unsure how to slow it down. The messages became more frequent, drifting from practical topics into personal ones, late night thoughts about choices they had made and chances they had missed, and Claire began waiting until Robert went to bed before replying so she wouldn't feel self conscious about the smile on her face. She learned about Daniel's college dreams that he had set aside to be responsible, about his fear of becoming invisible in his own home, and he learned about her younger years when she had wanted to travel across Canada, to see Vancouver's coastline and the streets of Montreal, before life became about raising a family and paying mortgages. They never said anything openly romantic, but there was a current under every message, a softness that hinted at deeper feelings. And Claire started to feel guilty when she caught herself choosing her phone over sitting beside her husband in the evenings. Robert remained kind but distracted, talking about work schedules and retirement plans, unaware that his wife's heart was slowly leaning elsewhere. Daniel struggled too because each time Emily spoke excitedly about future vacations or home renovations, he felt a twist of guilt knowing he was sharing his real thoughts with her mother instead of her, and yet he couldn't stop. Because with Claire, he felt seen and valued, and that feeling was powerful. One Saturday afternoon, they ran into each other at a small bookstore downtown, an unplanned meeting that left both of them surprised and slightly nervous. They stood between shelves discussing a novel Claire had recommended through text, their conversation flowing easily, laughter coming naturally, and for a moment the world outside seemed distant. But when Daniel noticed a couple walking past holding hands, reality returned quickly, reminding him of the line they were approaching. Claire sensed it too, the fragile boundary between comfort and something more, and when their fingers brushed while reaching for the same book, the contact was brief but electric enough to make her step back. She cleared her throat and said she should head home, yet as she drove away, she realized she was replaying the moment instead of pushing it aside. That evening, she sat across from Robert at the dinner table, listening to him talk about an upcoming fishing trip, and she felt a growing weight of dishonesty because emotionally she was investing her energy somewhere else. And though nothing physical had happened, she knew her heart was no longer fully present in her marriage. Daniel lay awake that same night, staring at the ceiling, phone in hand, debating whether to send another message, knowing each word pulled them closer to a place that could not stay secret forever. He typed, erased, typed again, finally sending a simple line saying he hoped she got home safely from the bookstore. And when her reply came thanking him and adding that she enjoyed their talk, he felt both comforted and uneasy. The connection that began as kindness had deepened into emotional reliance, and both of them sensed it, even if neither dared to name it directly. They were careful in public, respectful at family gatherings, but their private conversations grew longer, filled with questions about happiness and regret, about whether people could change their lives after decades of routine. Claire began to realize she was checking her phone first thing in the morning and last thing at night. And that realization frightened her because it meant Daniel had become more than just her son in law. He had become the person who made her feel alive again. Daniel understood it too, the night he caught himself smiling at a message from her while Emily sat beside him on the couch. And the contrast between the warmth in his phone and the distance in his marriage forced him to confront the truth. Emotionally, he had already crossed a line. Neither of them had planned for it, neither had set out to betray anyone. Yet, through small words, late night confessions, and shared loneliness, their bond had grown into something undeniable. And as winter slowly gave way to early spring, the snow melting into clear streets, the simplicity of their messages had transformed into a quiet secret that felt both beautiful and dangerously close to changing everything. The messages did not feel dangerous at first, and that was exactly why they continued. Because what began as simple check ins slowly turned into the most important part of Claire Whitman's day, and she did not even realize how deeply she was stepping into emotional territory she could not easily leave. After that snowy night, when she texted Daniel Harper to make sure he reached home safely, the pattern formed quickly. A good morning message about the weather, a short comment about traffic, a small joke about how quiet the house felt after Sunday dinners, and each exchange grew longer than the last. Daniel started sharing pieces of himself he rarely showed anyone, telling her about how distant his marriage to Emily felt, how conversations with his own wife now sounded forced, how he sometimes stayed longer at work just to avoid the silence at home. And Claire listened carefully, responding with calm words that made him feel understood instead of judged. She told herself she was offering guidance, that she was older and wiser, that she was helping him protect his marriage. Yet deep inside, she knew she looked forward to his name lighting up her phone more than she should. Robert remained unaware, moving through his routine of work, television, and weekend errands, never asking why Claire seemed distracted or why she smiled at her screen before quickly setting it down. Daniel noticed everything about Claire, from the way she described the book she loved to the way she admitted she once dreamed of opening a small art shop near the lake, but never tried because life became about responsibility. He encouraged her gently, telling her she still had time, that dreams did not expire, and his belief in her stirred emotions she had not felt in decades. One afternoon, he called instead of texting, saying he just needed to hear a friendly voice after a stressful meeting. And Claire hesitated before answering, aware that hearing each other would make the connection more real. Yet she picked up, and their conversation flowed easily, laughter slipping in between serious moments, both of them surprised at how natural it felt. When the call ended, Claire sat quietly in the kitchen, heart racing not from fear but from excitement, realizing she had not enjoyed a conversation like that with Robert in years. Daniel began finding reasons to stop by the Whitman house when he knew Emily was busy, returning borrowed items or dropping off mail. And though the visits were brief and proper, the air between them felt charged with unspoken emotion. Compliments remained respectful but meaningful, like when he told her she had a calming presence, or that her advice helped him think clearly, and each word settled into her heart with weight. Claire started dressing with more care on days she knew she might see him, choosing brighter colors, styling her hair differently, noticing the reflection in the mirror with a renewed sense of awareness, and she felt both alive and guilty at the same time. Daniel struggled internally because he understood the line they were nearing, yet he convinced himself that since nothing physical had happened, they were still safe, still decent, still within bounds, even though emotionally he relied on her more than anyone else. Their conversations shifted from daily updates to deeper questions about happiness, about whether people stayed in marriages out of love or fear of change, about whether comfort was enough to build a life on, and Claire found herself answering honestly instead of carefully, admitting she sometimes felt invisible, admitting she missed feeling admired, admitting she wondered what it would be like to start over. Daniel listened closely, his responses thoughtful and steady, and the more they shared, the more their bond strengthened in quiet but undeniable ways. At family gatherings, they acted normal, careful not to linger too long in conversation, careful not to exchange looks that might raise suspicion. Yet, even across a crowded room, their awareness of each other was constant, subtle glances filled with meaning no one else could read. One evening, after a long talk about regrets and missed chances, Daniel sent a message that changed the tone completely. He wrote that speaking to her made him feel understood, in a way he had not felt in years, that her presence brought him peace, and though the words were not romantic in an obvious way, the feeling behind them was clear. Claire stared at the screen for several minutes before replying, her heart beating fast as she typed that she felt the same comfort when talking to him, that their conversations meant more than she expected, and pressing send felt like stepping across a fragile boundary. From that moment forward, silence between them felt heavy, and even a few hours without a message created restlessness. Claire began waiting for the sound of her phone in the evenings, checking it before bed, carrying it from room to room as if afraid to miss something important, while Robert remained focused on retirement plans and fishing trips, unaware that his wife's emotional world was shifting. Daniel felt the weight of secrecy growing, especially when Emily asked casually who he was texting, and he answered vaguely, hating the dishonesty yet unable to stop, because the connection filled a space he had ignored for too long. One Saturday, they unexpectedly crossed paths at a lakeside park near Chicago, both out for separate walks, and instead of keeping distance, they chose to sit on a bench and talk, the cold wind brushing past as their conversation deepened face to face. They spoke about courage, about fear of hurting others, about the cost of staying silent in unhappy situations. And when their eyes met, there was a quiet understanding that their relationship was no longer just friendly support. No promises were made, no physical lines were crossed. Yet when they stood to leave, neither wanted the moment to end, and that hesitation revealed more than words ever could. That night, Claire lay awake beside Robert, staring at the ceiling, realizing she was emotionally invested in another man. And the truth both thrilled and frightened her, because she had always seen herself as loyal and steady. Daniel lay awake too, aware that his heart was drifting further from his marriage and closer to something uncertain but powerful. What began as harmless messages had become emotional dependence, and though they still avoided saying anything openly romantic, the depth of their connection was impossible to ignore, and both understood that if they continued down this path, choices would eventually have to be made. By early spring, the secret no longer felt light or exciting. It felt heavy, pressing on Claire Whitman's chest each morning when she opened her eyes beside Robert and reached for her phone before her feet touched the floor. Because before she even spoke to her husband, she was reading a message from Daniel Harper, and that truth forced her to confront how far things had gone without a single dramatic moment marking the change. The emotional connection that once felt comforting now carried consequences, and Claire sensed it every time Emily called to chat about small things, while Claire answered with a steady voice hiding the storm inside her. Daniel felt the pressure too. At work, he struggled to focus, replaying conversations with Claire in his mind, wondering how something that started as kindness had grown into the center of his thoughts. They had not crossed physical boundaries, but emotionally they were deeply involved, sharing fears, hopes, and dreams they had never shared with their own spouses. And the weight of that secrecy grew harder to carry. One afternoon, Claire sat alone in her car outside a grocery store, staring at a message from Daniel that read, "I don't know how much longer I can pretend everything is fine." And her heart pounded because she felt the same. That evening, she suggested they meet in a public place to talk clearly, not as secret companions, but as two adults facing a difficult truth. And they chose a quiet bench near Lake Michigan, where the wind was strong enough to keep most people away. When Daniel arrived, his expression was serious, no longer softened by playful messages or gentle jokes. He looked tired but determined. Claire folded her hands in her lap and spoke first, saying they needed to be honest about what was happening, that they were no longer just talking as family, and Daniel agreed, admitting that his feelings had grown beyond simple friendship. The words hung in the air between them, not dramatic, not loud, but powerful enough to shift their futures. Claire felt tears rise, not from guilt alone, but from the realization that she had allowed herself to wake up emotionally after years of feeling invisible, and now she could not return to sleep. Daniel confessed that his marriage to Emily had been fragile long before he leaned on Claire, that he had tried to fix it quietly but felt disconnected no matter how hard he tried. And hearing that both comforted and hurt Claire because it meant their bond had grown in the cracks of two struggling marriages. She asked him gently whether he believed they were running toward each other or simply running away from unhappiness, and he paused before answering that maybe it was both. But either way, he could not ignore what he felt anymore. Claire looked out at the gray water, realizing that staying in her marriage out of habit would now feel dishonest, not just to Robert, but to herself. And that thought frightened her because it meant change was no longer optional. When they stood to leave, they did not hold hands, but their eyes carried a shared understanding that the next steps would alter many lives. That night, Claire sat across from Robert at the kitchen table after dinner, the same table where they had shared decades of routine conversations, and she felt her heartbeat echo in her ears as she told him they needed to talk seriously. Robert sensed the shift immediately, turning off the television and giving her his full attention, something he had not done in a long time. Claire spoke carefully, explaining that she felt distant, that she had been unhappy for years but had never voiced it clearly, that she no longer felt connected in the way a marriage requires. And though she did not mention Daniel's name, she admitted she could not continue pretending everything was fine. Robert listened quietly, his expression moving from confusion to sadness, and when he finally spoke, he did not raise his voice. He simply asked why she had never told him sooner. Claire answered honestly that she had not understood her own loneliness until recently, that she had grown used to silence and called it stability, and now she realized she needed something more than routine. The conversation lasted hours, calm but painful, filled with shared memories and hard truths, and by the end, Claire said the word separation out loud, feeling both fear and relief as it left her lips. Robert nodded slowly, hurt but composed, saying he wished they had tried harder together, and Claire knew that was true. Yet she also knew her heart had already shifted. Across town, Daniel faced his own breaking point when Emily confronted him about his distant behavior, asking why he seemed somewhere else even when sitting beside her. And for the first time, he did not offer a vague excuse. Instead, he admitted that he felt disconnected, that their marriage had been drifting, and that he could not ignore it anymore. Emily was shocked and deeply hurt, asking if there was someone else, and Daniel hesitated before saying there were feelings he needed to understand, choosing careful honesty rather than detailed confession, knowing the truth would surface eventually, but not wanting to cause unnecessary damage in that moment. The tension that followed was heavy, yet it also cleared the fog that had surrounded their marriage for years, forcing both of them to confront what they had avoided. Over the next weeks, decisions moved quickly. Claire met with a lawyer, Daniel and Emily discussed counseling but realized their bond had weakened beyond repair, and the quiet suburban routine that once felt stable began to unravel. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic scenes, only difficult conversations and tearful nights as families adjusted to a new reality. Claire felt guilt when she saw Emily's sadness, knowing her choices contributed to it. Yet she also felt a growing sense of authenticity because she was finally living truthfully instead of silently enduring. Daniel wrestled with regret and hope at the same time, understanding that love, born in complicated circumstances, carried responsibility, and he questioned whether they were strong enough to face the consequences. Through it all, Claire and Daniel limited their contact, agreeing that they needed to resolve their own marriages before deciding what future, if any, they could build together. And that restraint showed a maturity neither of them had displayed earlier. As spring turned warmer and the days grew longer, Claire moved into a small apartment not far from the lake. starting over in a quiet space that felt both lonely and full of possibility, while Daniel adjusted to a new routine of shared custody discussions and honest reflection. The breaking point had not been loud or explosive. It had been steady and unavoidable, built from months of emotional honesty that could no longer be hidden. And though hearts were bruised and relationships ended, the truth had finally stepped into the open, leaving Claire and Daniel standing at the edge of uncertain futures, aware that whatever came next would require courage they were only beginning to understand. The months after the separations felt quiet but heavy, like the stillness after a storm when the sky looks clear, yet the ground is still wet. And Claire Whitman often stood by the window of her small apartment near Lake Michigan, wondering how her life had changed so completely in such a short time. She had lived in the same house with Robert for over 3 decades, raised a daughter, built routines around holidays and Sunday dinners, and now she was learning how to drink her morning coffee alone in a space that echoed with unfamiliar silence. The divorce process moved forward respectfully, without shouting or public drama, just paperwork, meetings, and careful conversations about dividing years of shared belongings. And though Robert remained calm, the sadness in his eyes stayed with her long after each meeting ended. Emily struggled deeply with the changes, feeling as if her family had fractured all at once, and Claire carried guilt for the pain her decisions caused. Yet she also knew that returning to her old life out of fear would only create deeper wounds later. Daniel Harper faced his own difficult adjustment, moving into a rental condo across town, splitting time between work and serious talks with Emily about how to separate kindly, and there were nights when he sat alone on his couch, questioning whether following his heart had been brave or reckless. He and Claire kept distance during those first months, agreeing that they needed space to close old chapters before opening a new one. And that separation was harder than either expected because, after sharing so much emotionally, silence felt unnatural. Still, they respected the boundary, limiting contact to brief check ins about practical matters, determined not to rush something that had already grown in complicated soil. Claire focused on rebuilding herself, joining a local book club in Chicago, walking by the lake in the evenings, reconnecting with friends she had not seen in years, and slowly rediscovering parts of her identity that had been buried under routine. She even began exploring the idea of opening a small art and stationery shop, researching locations, sketching ideas in a notebook, and for the first time in years, she felt nervous in a hopeful way, rather than an anxious one. Daniel also turned inward, attending counseling sessions to understand how his marriage had faded, learning to take responsibility for the distance he allowed to grow, and realizing that emotional honesty should never wait until resentment builds. Those conversations were humbling but necessary, and they strengthened his resolve to build any future relationship on clarity instead of secrecy. As summer approached, the divorce between Claire and Robert finalized peacefully, marked not by celebration but by quiet acceptance. And though Robert wished things had turned out differently, he told her he hoped she would find happiness, a gesture that both comforted and saddened her because it reminded her that endings can hold kindness too. Daniel and Emily reached their own agreement with mutual respect, acknowledging that love sometimes changes form and that forcing it to stay the same can hurt everyone involved. And though the transition was painful, they committed to handling it with maturity for the sake of their shared history. Only after those chapters fully closed did Claire and Daniel meet again intentionally, choosing a small cafe in Toronto where Claire had traveled to visit a friend, a neutral place far from the neighborhood where everything began. When they saw each other, there was no dramatic embrace, just a long look filled with understanding of everything they had lost and learned. They talked for hours about the past year, about mistakes, about growth, about the cost of their choices, and this time their words carried no secrecy, only openness, because they were no longer hiding from spouses or pretending feelings did not exist. Daniel admitted he feared that what they felt might fade once the intensity of secrecy disappeared, and Claire appreciated his honesty, replying that real love should survive daylight, not just shadows, and that if they were to move forward, it had to be slow and grounded in respect for everyone affected. They agreed to take small steps, to date carefully, to allow trust to build naturally rather than rushing toward a dramatic future, and that decision reflected how much they had matured through the storm. Over the following weeks, they met openly, walking along the waterfront, visiting art galleries, sharing dinners without fear of being seen. And though whispers circulated among extended family members, they chose transparency over defense, answering questions calmly and acknowledging the complicated path that led them there. Emily needed time and distance, and Claire respected that, sending a heartfelt letter expressing love and regret without excuses, understanding that healing cannot be forced. Daniel supported that space as well, knowing that patience was part of responsibility. As autumn returned and the leaves began to change again, Claire signed a lease on a small storefront near the lake to open her long dreamed shop, naming it Second Chapter, a quiet symbol of starting over, and Daniel stood beside her on opening day, not as a secret, but as a partner who had walked through difficult growth. Their relationship was no longer built on stolen conversations or late night messages. It was built on shared accountability, on the understanding that love should not thrive in shadows, and that truth, even when painful, creates stronger ground than silence. They did not pretend the past year had been easy or that everyone healed quickly, but they committed to living honestly, accepting that real relationships require courage, humility, and patience. Sometimes Claire still felt waves of sadness for the life she once had, and Daniel sometimes wondered how different choices earlier might have changed everything. Yet neither regretted choosing authenticity over quiet unhappiness. On cool evenings, they walked by the water, hands gently intertwined, aware that their story began in complicated circumstances but continued with clarity and intention. And though the future remained uncertain, it was no longer hidden, because the secret that once lived in whispers had transformed into a relationship tested by consequence and rebuilt with care, proving that while love can begin in fragile moments, it only survives when brought fully into the light.